GOP gubernatorial primary debate, live from the Dogwood Room at Fairfield University. I'm your moderator for tonight, Mike Bellamy, of Tony and Mike in the Morning on WICC 600. Joining me on the panel this evening is Dr. Gail Alberta, an assistant professor of politics and public administration here at Fairfield University, and Dr. Gary Rose, professor and chair in the Department of Government, Politics, and Global Studies at Sacred Heart University. We first would like to thank the staff of Fairfield University and President Mark Nemec. They have been wonderful hosts for tonight's debate. Each Republican primary gubernatorial candidate has been invited for this evening's debate. Danbury Mayor Mark Boughton has declined our invitation. Before the broadcast, we had a random drawing to determine the order in which the candidates answer the questions. The first one will be Tim Herbst, followed by Steve Obsidnik, Bob Stefanowski, and David Stemmerman. We have asked the audience here to refrain from clapping or making any comments during the debate, as that may affect the time that is allowed for each question. Now, we will follow the traditional debate format in accordance with the guidelines established by the League of Women Voters. Each candidate will get 1 minute for an opening statement. There will be 6 questions asked by our panel this evening. Each candidate will get 2 minutes to answer that question, and also a 1-minute rebuttal after each candidate has answered the question, after they have answered the questions originally. There will be a 2-minute closing statement per candidate. Well, now that we've established the rules and we have our candidates on the stage, let's hear our opening statements from each of the candidates, starting with Mr. Herbst.
Thank you, Mike, and I want to thank our moderators, and I want to thank Fairfield University for hosting us tonight. This is the most consequential and important election of our lifetime. When we look back on this moment 30 years from tonight, we will be able to ask ourselves, after the November elections, did we do everything in our power to restore the promise of Connecticut, to guarantee that the reality of Connecticut lived up to that promise? I am running for governor of the state of Connecticut to completely dismantle and upend business as usual, to put taxpayers and people first. In Trumbull, I inherited and fixed a broken pension system. 8 balanced budgets and 2 tax cuts later, the Trumbull turnaround did not happen by accident. It required leadership, it required vision, and it required guts. As governor, I will bring that same passion to Hartford, working to fix a broken pension system, making Connecticut affordable and competitive, reducing the tax burden, reducing the size of government, getting back to fixing our roads, our highways, and our bridges so we can invest in our infrastructure and make this state what it once was, the greatest state in the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsidnik.
Good evening, and thank you, Fairfield University and the moderators, for hosting us here. My name is Steve Obsidnik, and Connecticut needs a job creator as your next governor. Connecticut needs someone with the experience, character, and plan to restore fiscal stability to our state and build 300,000 jobs in Connecticut. Connecticut also needs a Republican nominee who is a Republican and someone who can win in November. Look, I grew up in Stanford. I attended the U.S. Naval Academy. I did my submarine service down the road in Groton. I spent most of my time chasing Russian submarines under the polar ice cap. I've created 3 successful high-tech companies around jobs that we need here in Connecticut now more than ever. Tonight I'll talk to you about my plan, a 5-step plan to build 300,000 jobs over the next 8 years. In this election, you deserve someone who is battle-tested, who will take on this fight and will turn Connecticut around once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
So thanks everyone for coming. 1984, I graduated from this university, Fairfield U Stags, and it seems like just yesterday. I was an accounting major. It was not the most exciting major in the world, but I had a job up in Hartford within 8 weeks of graduating. I was a senior executive at GE, a company with 300,000 employees, where I turned around multi-billion-dollar failing businesses. I was CFO of UBS Investment Bank. We had a $500 billion balance sheet over 35 countries. This school and this state have been good to me. We need to provide that opportunity for our people. The only way we're going to do it is to put somebody in charge who has run big organizations before. No one on this stage, or people that are not on this stage, other than I, have the experience running large, complex organizations, the ability to negotiate, to gain consensus, to cut cost, and deliver on a plan. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I'm going to do it for the state of Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmer.
So the election to date has been about introductions. Today, it's about choices. It's about differentiation. You have a choice to make on August 14th. And I would submit to you there are 3 reasons why I should be that choice. The first is our state is in a lot of trouble. It needs change. It needs a business person, an outsider, to fix our state, to save it from a financial crisis, and to get it growing again. The second is we need someone who has a vision and a plan. We are the only campaign in either party that just doesn't talk in sound bites about cutting taxes, cutting spending, and bringing jobs, but we have an actual plan to do it. The last one I'm a bit surprised to say is for the Republican primary, you need a Republican. You need somebody who has been a Republican, who has voted for Republicans, who has supported Republicans, that we can trust, so support Republican values. I'm the only candidate that's 3 for 3. I look forward to your support on August 14th.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. We're now ready for our first question, which will be for Tim Herbst from Dr. Gail Alberta.
This year, Governor Malloy signed the equal pay law that was passed by the state legislature with bipartisan support. On a similar topic, we have paid family leave. Our neighbors, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey, have adopted paid family leave. The past 4 years, our state legislature has introduced a paid family leave bill. Never made it out. If elected governor and the state legislature were to send you this bill, would you sign it?
Well, I have to tell you that the first thing I would ask the legislature to do when they're considering any type of legislation like that is to recognize other laws that they have passed over the course of the last 8 years that have been harmful to entrepreneurs, business owners, and job creators. I hear this every single day on the campaign trail in every corner of the state of Connecticut. We're very good at passing laws that place a lot of requirements on employers. And there needs to be a recognition that when you pass these laws and put these additional regulations and burdens on employers, what you're doing is increasing the cost of their ability to do business. And when you increase the cost of their doing business, they're going to do 2 things. They're either not going to hire people to work for them, or they're going to find another state to which to locate their business. If you look at some of the policies that this governor has pursued over the course of the last 8 years, not only with the things that you mentioned, but also the additional regulations that have been put on businesses, the punitive nature that our state agencies have taken towards our business owners and job creators, many of them small business owners and job creators. I meet a lot of business owners who talk about the onerous cost of doing business, not only with taxes, but also regulations that create fees, that create additional costs to job creators and employers. So before we talk about any new laws that are going to put additional cost requirements on business owners, we're going to first talk about how we're going to make it easier for them to grow their business, create jobs, hire people, and get our economy jump-started again. This governor has been an absolute unmitigated disaster when it comes, and this legislature, I might add, current legislature, has been a disaster in how they have treated business owners, job creators, and those that are looking to get ahead. If I get elected governor, that's going to change, and I cannot do it alone. The people of the state of Connecticut have to elect a Republican Senate and a Republican House that will make the changes legislatively that I will sign into law to rebuild our economy and get Connecticut moving again.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsitnik.
Thank you for the question. My wife works and has worked ever since I met her at business school. I have 2 daughters, 14 and 16. I hope they go into a world where they receive equal pay for a similar job. When it looks at specific legislation, I think you have to first listen and talk to people. I'm an evidence-based person. I sit down and I talk to legislators and other experts in the field. I do think that anything like this, you do have to look at a cost-benefit analysis to see what the impact is going to be on business. Because the reality is, since I graduated from Stanford High, we've created 5,600 total net jobs since then. 5,600. Texas builds 200,000 a year. So my lens through which I will look at things on any topic will be, will that help us build 300,000 jobs, yes or no? And that's why my 5-step plan to 300,000 jobs addresses things like how do we make Connecticut more affordable? And we'll talk more, I think, about the level of taxation. How do we make government, which is outdated and too expensive, more efficient and deliver the services that you need in a digital world? How do we actually, step 3, get the cholesterol out of the system of forming businesses in Connecticut? And Connecticut needs to take a big fat Lipitor because it's too hard to start a business here. And we'll talk about other things about career corridors. So I would want to see what legislation that is. It's not a hard no for me, but I'm an evidence-based person. If it builds 300,000 jobs and I talk to experts around it, we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Obsitnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, when I first decided to run, I went down to Tennessee. Tennessee is a state with no state income tax and very little government interference in business. And I met with a guy by the name of Art Laffer, who I've known for 20 years. Art was Ronald Reagan's chief economist, and he also just wrote the tax plan for Donald Trump. And Art and I agree on this. Government needs to stay out of the way. 99 times out of 100, the private sector is infinitely better at running things than the government sector. Just look at the Department of Motor Vehicles. If you don't think the private sector could come in and give you a license and the other things they do under less time with less cost, I'd love to talk to you after the debate tonight. We need to spur business in this state. That's why my economic plan, a 5-point economic plan endorsed by Art Laffer, reviewed by Larry Kudlow, eliminate the estate tax, get rid of the corporate income tax over 2 years, get rid of the state income tax. Yes, get rid of it. Others will say it's a dream. Others will say you can't do it. That's exactly the small-minded thinking from Dan Malloy that's gotten us into the position that we're in. I've got a rational plan. I'm going to work with business. We're also going to rip out cost. I'll talk to that a little bit later. But we need to create an environment in this state where small and mid-sized business can flourish. It's not going to be done by putting additional requirements on business. It's going to be done by reducing regulation, reducing cost, bringing companies back into the state. That'll create jobs, that'll create income, and that'll create a virtuous cycle. What we have right now is a death spiral by Dan Malloy of raising taxes, raising regulations, and tax revenues going down. I've been doing it for 30 years for the same size entities as the state of Connecticut. That's what we need to do it again.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmer.
So Bob doesn't have a plan to cut taxes. He has a cut and paste presentation that he paid $50,000 for that could be put up in an academic institution like we have here. We have in our plan a plan that could actually be done. Bob, I'm a bit surprised that as a guy who's run a business that you don't seem to understand the numbers here. And for the numbers, that's going to be critical if we're going to be able to turn our state around. Our state is facing an $11 billion budget deficit over the next 4 years. Mark Bowden, who's a career politician who made the same kind of empty promises that you're making here and all over this state, he was called out. Just yesterday when he was on ABC News, he was asked, well, tell me a little bit more about your tax plan, which costs $9.5 billion per year. He said, well, I can get you to about $380 million in the first year. I can do about the same amount the next year, and then it's going to be pretty tough. Mayor Mark, where are you tonight? This plan is a bunch of nonsense. It's not a plan. It's a poll-tested, nonsensical way to get himself elected. I can only imagine what was going through his mind in July of 2017 after he had registered as being a Democrat just weeks before the presidential election. If you want to have any statement about what do you believe in your affiliation, he changed to be a Democrat 3 weeks before Donald Trump was on the ballot. And he didn't vote in that election. He didn't vote in any election. The most basic responsibility as a citizen is to vote. We've had members of our armed forces who were in the heart of conflict in Iraq who were able to vote by absentee ballot. But this man next to me, he couldn't be bothered to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. You're listening to a special broadcast of the WICC 600 GOP gubernatorial primary debate live from Fairfield University. We now have our 1-minute rebuttals. We go back to Mr. Herbst.
Let me just say this. Every person in theory should not want an income tax. And the reason why many people in this state, and a lot of people in this room, fought that tax going in 1991 was because they recognized once you put it in, it's going to be very difficult to pull it back. That's why people fought it in 1991. And here's what everyone has to acknowledge. And this is where we have disagreements. Of course I want to reduce taxes. Of course I want to make Connecticut more affordable. But you are not going to reduce any tax in the state of Connecticut, much less eliminate a tax that accounts for 55% of your total revenues in the budget unless and until you acknowledge there is an at least $86 billion problem in the state with unfunded pension and retiree health care liabilities. I am the only candidate that has consistently said that if you do not confront this problem right out of the gate, 4 years from now, we'll be talking about budget deficits that are even larger, a continued mass exodus following tax increases with no relief in sight. We've got to deal with the unfunded liabilities right out of the gate.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Sidney.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to talk about a lot of plans tonight, and I really appreciate this format for getting into it here. But I believe that I'm the only one who actually built my own plan. I didn't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of people to build it, or fancy DC political people to pull things and put it out there. This 5-step plan to 300,000 jobs over the next 8 years is something I spent 4 years building, going around the state, and even now in my RV. We call it RV1 instead of Air Force One. And I've gotten a lot of input from you all about what needs to be in there. So, these plans need to be vetted, and that's why I focus on targeted tax reductions. 4% back to you all, $400 million to hug the customers of Connecticut, seniors, working class people, and corporations. While we match that with $3.5 billion of cost savings along the way, which I have detailed and been very specific in my plan. So this plan is detailed, specific, and innovative, and it talks about how we have to rebuild the career corridors of Connecticut, which I'll get into later on this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Sidney. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, so I don't know what Mr. Stemmerman had for dinner tonight, but he seems a bit agitated. So let me address his comments. I was a Democrat for 9 months. I've been a Republican for 25 years. I've been endorsed by everybody from Peter Lamars to Arthur Laffer to Len Suzio. This criticism's coming from a guy on my left who was a Democrat for 7 years. Voted as a Democrat for 7 years in the state of New York. Gave thousands of dollars to Barack Obama. Steve, how about an idea, David? Why don't we talk about the real issues that people want to talk about, which is who's best equipped to be the next governor, rather than slinging mud at each other, which is exactly what the Democrats want us to do. Let's talk about who has the best plan, who's run something other than a 50-person hedge fund, and who actually knows how to grow and improve this state. Let's try that a little bit, David, and try to get some real content up there.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmer.
Nice try, Bob. The facts are the facts. The facts are that you were a Democrat, and you chose to be a Democrat less than 12 months from the date of this election. The date that you decided to become a Republican is the date that you announced your affiliation with this party. There are rules that say that changing of a party affiliation within 2 years is such a strong indication that you do not support the principles of the party, that the party can kick you out of the party, and that you could not be eligible for the ballot for that reason. And I wouldn't be surprised if the head of our party took that under their own consideration, whether you should even be eligible to be on the ballot, given that passed with yourself. In terms of myself, I contributed to Barack Obama. My college roommate's law firm was sponsoring an event. I didn't like what I heard. I supported and voted for and contributed to Giuliani and to hundreds of thousands of dollars for our campaign for Republican up and down the ticket.
Thank you, Mr.
Multiples of what you've done.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. We now have our second question from Dr. Gary Rose, and this one will go to Steve Sidney first.
Okay, thank you very much, and good evening, gentlemen. My question pertains to many of the younger voters in the room tonight, the generation known as millennials. Although tax policies in Connecticut have frequently been cited for the relocation of GE to Boston, the fact of the matter is that GE's relocation had much more to do with the availability of a younger, urban, and technologically savvy workforce in the Boston area compared to the workforce in our own state. Boston is also a far more exciting place for millennials to live and work compared to working in a Connecticut suburb like Fairfield, where GE was located, and living in one of our mid-sized and somewhat uneventful cities. So as our state's next governor, what will you do to convince millennials that Connecticut is a good state to pursue a career and a desirable state to live in. And I can state from experience teaching millennials that so many of them have every intention of leaving Connecticut when they get their degrees. So how will you as governor prevent the flight of millennials to places like Boston and New York City?
I want to first check. This is the Republican debate, right? Just kidding. I'll let Bob and Dave talk about who's more of a Democrat, and I appreciate your question. We're in the right place, right? Look, I taught a class at Quinnipiac University about 4 months ago, and I teach entrepreneurship at Sacred Heart. And I always start the first day of class with one question to people. I say to them, and I have 40 seniors at Quinnipiac, I say, raise your hand if you see yourself in Connecticut a year after graduating. Of those 40 graduating seniors, how many hands went up? One. And she was from Connecticut. So what we need is a governor who can paint a vision for people like me when I was young. Why did I go to California? Not a low-cost state, I have to tell you. I want the same thing that millennials want, to work on a cool project, to change the world, to live in a place where you're kind of inspired around the people you're around, and hopefully your family is there too. That's where my plan to build 300,000 jobs over the next 8 years relies on building around the career corridors of Connecticut. Because we got the bones here. We've just had horrible leadership in Dan Malloy over the last 8 years. In these career corridors, from Enfield down to New Haven, from Groton to Greenwich, 91 to 95, we have 42 trade schools to universities. And in those corridors, we have 24 Fortune 1000 companies who have not evicted themselves yet, and they've put up with a lot of misery. So what we need is a governor to paint a vision around the industries we do well, advanced manufacturing, finance and insurance, and healthcare delivery, and actually get businesses to communicate with schools what the needs are so we can have a supply chain of trained people to fill jobs. And there are 50,000 job openings in this state right now that I put my hands on. 7,000 software programming jobs that are open. We just need to do a better job of educating, building around our cities, which I'll talk more about, Roosevelt Island type approaches, so that people can live in the cities. The cities are our future, and we have to anchor them with applied research universities and jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Sidney. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, we need to create an environment where millennials have a reason to stay here. And the problem is between 1984, when I graduated from Fairfield, and today, Dan Malloy has ruined that opportunity for everybody. And it fundamentally starts with economic policy, being able to lower taxes and create jobs. Now, some up here will tell you you can't get rid of the state income tax. That is the single most deterrent to people in the state right now. Before 1991, the state of Connecticut worked perfectly fine without a state income tax. We were the fastest growing state in the entire nation. In the 25 years since, slowest in economic growth, horrible roads and bridges, and people fleeing this state like crazy. That's why my 5-point plan to get rid of the estate tax, lower that corporate tax, get rid of the income tax over 8 years, and we need to rip cost out of this budget like you've never seen. I did it as CFO of UBS. We had every single department come in. We used zero-based budgeting. So I don't care what was in your budget last year. Here's an idea. Let's assume it's zero. And we ripped $1 billion of cost out of UBS. We need to do the same thing for the state of Connecticut. We can use that tax base to fund education, to fund infrastructure, and to fund the creation of jobs. But you need somebody who's done it before. You can't come in here after running a town with a $120 million budget, or even worse, a hedge fund with 50 people. You know what a hedge fund does? They basically use other people's to gamble money on stocks. That's what they do. That's what Connecticut Capital does. They use other people's money to gamble trading stocks. That's not the skill set we need to keep our millennials in this state right now.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmer.
So you may be hearing that for every answer from Bob, it's the same play. You just hit play and repeat. And what he's talked about again and again and again is the same tax policy where the numbers don't add up and ripping out costs. The question that you asked, Gary, is how do we create a state that is attractive for millennials? In order to do that, you have to have a vision that's broader than that. I came to this state first to get an education at Yale. So people like here at Fairfield who came here for a great education. I came back to this state to get a job because there was a job opportunity. I came here to raise my family, my 5 children, and I started a business here because there were 3 reasons that made this state attractive. We got a great location between New York and Boston, the gateway to New England, and 600 miles of beautiful coastline. The second thing is we have excellent schools and a highly productive workforce. The third thing used to be we were affordable. We used to have lower taxes and a lower cost of living. When you put those 2 things together, from 1950 to 1990, this state was booming. My plan does address how to cut taxes and cut spending and gives you the numbers that you can actually believe in. But we go further. We have a plan specifically on how to rebuild our transportation infrastructure. So again, Gary, when I gave the introduction speech for my campaign in Fairfield, outside the former headquarters of GE, they told me the exact same story. They said, we can't get millennials to come here because it takes too long to commute. Well, we have a plan to attract billions of dollars of private capital to get the train from New York City to Stamford in 30 minutes, Bridgeport in 45, and New Haven in 60 minutes. So millennials can live in the city and still work here. And the last is in terms of education. We need to bring our educators and businesses together so they're developing exactly the skills that places like GE needs. We need to have that collaboration. Again, we put out a plan on our website just last week. Go look at it on our website, davidseverman.com.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
You know, one thing that you need to understand and have the capacity to understand as a governor, as a leader, as an elected official, because you are elected by the people, is that when you are a leader that's elected by the people, as I have been, the only person on stage who's been elected by the people, you have to understand that you're dealing with more than just dollars and cents and balance sheets. You're making decisions that impact people's lives every single day, impacting their public safety, impacting their educational future, impacting their taxes, impacting their quality of life. You're making decisions that impact people. And I think I have the best capacity to communicate with millennials because I'm the youngest candidate in this race. I understand the concerns that they have because I share those concerns. And I've seen my high school and college classmates flee the state of Connecticut for better opportunity. So how do we keep people here in our state? How do we stop this running joke that people can't wait to get the hell out of the state of Connecticut? Here's how we're going to keep kids here. Number one, we've got to invest in our cities and in housing that allows them to save and invest for the future. We've got to invest in our infrastructure. You know, people aren't going to want to stay here and pursue jobs here if they're going to spend 3 hours in the car going to and from work and worrying about whether they're going to be able to get to work on time. More importantly, there needs to be better collaboration with our colleges and our universities and the existing businesses that are here in developing curriculum and majors and focuses that will allow them to have jobs to go into when they graduate. That is where Connecticut's missed the ball. And the lack of collaboration between our Economic Development Department and our Department of Education clearly bears that out. They need a governor, a young governor who is focused on the next generation and not the next election. And they need a governor who didn't find his value system in a poll or a focus group, but is driven by principle.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Now time for our 1-minute rebuttals. Mr. Sidnick.
Look, I think I'm the only job builder in this race, someone who actually builds product for a living and has employed millennials in 3 successful companies. That's why day one, on top of the other parts of my plan, we will put out a request for expression of interest and ask what applied research university in the world wants to move to Connecticut. That's what happened on Roosevelt Island. That's what Michael Bloomberg did. He took a patch of dirt. He put down $100 million. 2 universities came, Cornell from Ithaca and Technion from Israel. They partnered with Google, Facebook, and Uber. The composition of that was they brought $1 billion. That's called leverage. In 6 years, they built 2.2 million square feet on this patch of dirt on Roosevelt Island. You have hospital, residential, retail. The millennials are flowing there. But if you've never built product, if you've never taken time to employ people like millennials to understand their interests, you wouldn't know to actually go out there and mimic a Roosevelt Island model. And I'm proud to say that the Commission on Fiscal Stability and Economic Growth took that idea that I had as a center point of their solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Sidnick. Mr. Stefanowski.
I actually agree with Steve. I think in order to create jobs for millennials, you actually have had to run a company that produces or delivers something. There's very few of us in this race that actually have, and Steve, I'll give you credit, you have. It's a very different skill set. You have to know how to negotiate with people. You have to know how to present opportunity. You have to know to deliver on a plan. There are plenty, trust me, there are plenty of numbers peoples out there that have 8,000-page plans. They're a dime a dozen. What we need in this state is leadership, somebody that's done it before, somebody that knows how to manage and lead and get people motivated. Think about Dan Malloy. Are we proud to have him in the governor's office right now? We need somebody in that seat a year from now who's a job creator, who has perspective, who doesn't run around trashing people, who talks about the ideas for the future and how we're going to deliver them. I've been doing it for 30 years. It's exactly what I'm going to do for the state of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
So I'd be delighted to actually tell you what my business is, what we actually did, because there seems to be a bit of confusion here. I started an investment business, Untitled Chapter, from a single desk in 2008. We invested in publicly traded stocks in all sectors of the economy all over the world. Our clients were pensions, they were schools, and they were families. They entrusted us with their money so that we wouldn't lose their money and so that we could grow their savings. We survived the worst financial crisis in 70 years, and we grew a business. You're not the only person on the stage that's employed people, Steve. I built a business myself, where there's a track record, where I employed people here. I was not an executive that was moved to London or moved to wherever. I built my own business. I was responsible for delivering the bottom line and the results, and I'm very proud of the people that I hired, the track record that we built, and the results we delivered over 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
When you have to work with 151 representatives and 36 senators, you don't go up to Harvard and say, you will do this or be fired. Government does not work that way. Believe me, you're not going to boss Brenda Kupchik around. She's a pretty solid thinker. So you have to have the capacity to understand the political environment, the fact that you're dealing with a divided House, a divided Senate. The next governor is going to inherit a divided government. You're going to have very close margins in the House and the Senate. And it's going to take a skill set that recognizes if you're going to pass any legislation, you have to understand the different and competing philosophies. You have to understand what it's going to take to get consensus. And you're going to have to understand that government is about identifying and prioritizing what is critical, not both in the short term, but more importantly, in the long term.
You're listening to a special broadcast of the WICC 600 GOP gubernatorial primary debate, live from Fairfield University. We are on to our third question, which will go first to Mr. Stefanowski. Asking the question will be Dr. Gail Alberta.
After Sandy Hook in 2012, the state legislature passed and the governor signed a bipartisan piece of legislation that was at the time the strictest gun laws in the country, currently the second strictest. These laws included a provision that required schools to submit a school security and safety plan to the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection each year. There was a report issued last year that indicated that only 25% of all of Connecticut schools are in compliance. My question to you is this: as a mom with a school-aged child, how will you as governor increase the compliance and keep our kids safe?
Thank you for that question. And yeah, I'm a dad with 3 school-aged children, and it's an issue that's very sensitive to me as well. I think when you step back and talk about the Second Amendment, we have to protect the rights of law-abiding gun owners in this state. This governor has done a horrible job of representing the interest of people that have gone through the right background checks and are entitled by their Second Amendment rights to have a firearm. That needs to stop. Having said that, we need to keep the guns out of the hands of the people that should not have them. That's the problem. That's what this governor has failed to invest in. It comes down to mental health and providing the support, the funding, and the development need to help these people. That's where the tragedies are happening. And then finally, we got to keep our kids safe. I would argue it should be up to the local school districts to decide what they need. But that's the #1 priority, is keeping our kids safe in school. So it's not an and or, it's how do we protect the rights of gun owners and keep the guns out of the hands of that minority of people who should not have them so that our kids and our families are safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
This is an area where we both share the perspective of we have children. I see you have your family here. I have 5 children of my own, and they go to school, and there's nothing more important to me and my wife that they come home safely at the end of the day. And for the governor, whoever it is on this stage that's our next governor, that will be their most important responsibility. And so that's why this is such an issue of importance for all of us here. I don't believe that solving this problem going forward is going to be about changing our gun laws going forward. I share Bob's view that we're protected not only in the federal constitution, but in the state constitution of the people having the right to bear arms to protect themselves and to protect their families. The question is, what are we going to do in our schools to make them safer? And Gail, that was really your question. One is to make sure that people who have mental illness, who are a danger to themselves as well as to the community, that we know who they are and that we're providing the appropriate treatment. That was supposed to be part of the gun laws, but of course that was not what was actually followed up on, and we need to make sure to do so. The second is we need to make sure that for our law enforcement officials, that they not only have the training, but they have the communication, so that if somebody is identified as potential risks to their community, that we know about them, that we don't have a revolving door of people coming in and out of either mental health or out of our criminal justice system, and that they're treated appropriately, and it keeps our streets safe and our schools safe. The last thing is the way that I look about solving problems is I say, who has had this problem and how they've solved it? In Israel, 20 years ago, after decades of conflict, if you can believe it, they began targeting school children. And in Israel, it's a place they know something about security. I would go there, and I would say, how can we harden the targets of the schools? How can we create better surveillance with our schools? And how can we, where appropriate, have somebody with the appropriate training and the appropriate weapons to protect our most precious assets, our children?
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
I'm the only person on this stage that has been required to lead an emergency management team. I'm the only person on this stage who knows what it's like to get that 3 a.m. phone call from your chief of police when you have to leave in the middle of the night and to go out into the field to respond to a public safety crisis. And I was a mayor and first selectman during the worst tragedy in the history of the state of Connecticut, and worked with my colleagues in Monroe and Newtown to help that community recover and to make sure those kids were transferred to a safe and suitable environment to continue their education. The most solemn duty of the governor of the state of Connecticut is a duty that I took seriously as a municipal leader. The most solemn duty of the governor of the state of Connecticut is to protect the people of the state of Connecticut, and that includes, most especially, kids in our schools. School shootings that we have seen have shocked our country, shocked our conscience, and it's caused a tremendous debate in our nation. Let me say this. I support the right of law-abiding citizens to safely train in the use of firearms, and I, as governor, will raise my right hand to defend not only the Constitution of the state of Connecticut, of the United States, but also the state of Connecticut, Article 1, Section 15. The people shall have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of themselves and the state. But here's where we missed the ball with SB 1160. And there are parts of that law, to the root of your question, that have not even been acted upon. After Newtown, I told our police department that I wanted a comprehensive school security program put in place to make sure that those buildings were hardened and to make sure that our kids were safe. I insisted that school security officers be retired law enforcement because they had requisite training. The next governor needs to insist that the Sandy Hook Commission reports are fully implemented with respect to mental health funding. Also, there needs to be greater information sharing between local law enforcement and school districts about potential threats before they materialize. And quite frankly, I believe all school security divisions, by law, should be under the jurisdiction of local law enforcement. And when I mean by that is local police. I feel very strongly on that.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Herbst.
Yeah, as a former nuclear submarine officer and operations officer of the United States Navy, I've had my fair share of emergency management meetings, operations, and let's just go on record for that. You know, like as the 3 gentlemen to my left here, I have 2 daughters in the public school system as well, and there was an attempted attack in our local high school, and I had 2 daughters come home from school, and I saw that day change their life, and thank goodness nothing happened around it, but I think it rose awareness in them of the world that we live in. As a military veteran, I do support, the Second Amendment constitutionally and what the state's constitution says. The role of a governor, first and foremost, is to preserve the safety and security of the people of Connecticut. As it relates to your question, Gail, I would first want to understand why towns aren't complying. Why only 25%? I'm an evidence-based person. I want to understand what's holding them back, because I don't think that towns would want to innately put their kids at risk. There's got to be some reason in there why. But I know when I go pick my kids up at school sometimes, the slide door is still flapping open. I could walk in, right? So something is still not right, and we have targets that, we have schools that remain targets. So I would put in place a system and a process to understand what is happening and what is not happening so that we can get at the root cause of this so we can drive security and safety for our children. And I think it was said right before that the goal of security is to keep guns out of the hands of people, terrorists, criminals, and people that have mental challenges that will do harm. And under this budget of Dan Malloy, he has done everything to cut mental health spending. So, because the fixed costs of Connecticut are rising. So it's another reason why we have to right-size the size of our government by $3.5 billion so we can now afford to pay for safety and security of the people of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. We're now ready for our 1-minute rebuttals. Mr. Stefanowski.
Yeah, I think it gets back to what we said in the first round. The priority is protecting our kids. You think about a museum or even a ballpark, you go in there, you're checked. There's limited access. There's all sorts of controls. You go in a typical school, to your point, Steve, you can go in any door whatsoever. It's practical common sense that we start to protect with reasonable measures. The problem with government is there's no common sense. So we need somebody, and none of this is rocket science, none of this needs a 45-page study to the 5th decimal point. It's common sense. Put the controls in to protect our kids, keep the guns out of people who shouldn't have them in their hands, and protect the rights of gun owners who have done nothing wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
I think this question also speaks to the style and quality of leadership we're going to have in this state. So this is a subject that has provoked marches on both sides of the aisle. And what I see is a case of those on both sides trying to divide us, when what we need in protecting our children is somebody who will bring us together. If we look at who we want to have be our nominee on August 14th, so that we can win this election on November 6th and govern on the other side, we need somebody who's going to bring people together. Just a couple of weekends ago, I was marching in Bridgeport in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, and I shook hundreds of hands. I think there were more Republicans in the front row here than I saw the entire day. When I spoke to them, they had the same aspirations that we have here. They want lower taxes. They want a more affordable place. They want jobs. They want better schools, and they want safety. What we need is a leader that appeals to everyone and can bring us all together.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
When you make decisions that you know are going to impact people's lives, and you have to make decisions about protecting people, you don't make those decisions in a black and white way. And you don't do it in a matter-of-fact way. It takes deliberation, it takes seriousness, and it takes a recognition of the responsibility that you have to protect people. The reason why that only 25% of local school districts have begun compliance is because very much it is a funding issue. Because a lot of these school buildings are older school buildings, and a lot of our construction in the 21st century is newer construction. So it's a cost that is hard for towns and cities to cope with, because they don't want to have to raise their property taxes. But this is what Hartford does. And I understand this as a municipal leader better than most. They're very good at passing laws that put additional burdens on local towns and cities, which cause taxes to go up, which they do not fund. So if the state of Connecticut wants 100% compliance with school security programs, the state of Connecticut is also going to have to put skin in the game to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsidnik.
Yeah, I'd add on to that, there are 1,200 unfunded mandates put down on towns, mostly on the education system. And I can give you many examples that don't yield benefit to the towns. So removing a lot of these 1,200 unfunded mandates and the minimum budget requirement, which forces towns not to put a floor on their education, they can only reduce their spending by 1%. I think you have to give flexibility back to the towns so they can get property tax rates to where they should be at and make decisions on funding and hardening targets, as that's important. But all I'll say is, as a Navy veteran who's patrolled these waters out here, as your next governor, safety and security is what I believe in and will be the primary job which I will execute.
You're listening to a special broadcast of the WICC 600 GOP gubernatorial primary debate, live from the Dogwood Room here at Fairfield University. We are at our halfway points. We're now on to question number 4. This one is for David Stemmerman and from Dr. Gary Rose.
Okay, thank you very much. In a meeting I was in with WICC, I said I was going to ask this question, and it was described by one individual there as really the elephant in the room. Unfunded pension liabilities. Unfunded pension liabilities are currently a major issue in the state of Connecticut. The Volcker Alliance, which conducts detailed studies and analyses of state financial practices, gave an embarrassing grade of D to Connecticut for the manner in which our state's leaders have been handling the administration and funding of state pensions. So, if elected governor, how will you get pension liabilities under control, and what measures will you take? And I would appreciate specifics on this question. What measures will you take to reduce the deleterious impact that state pension liabilities are having on our state's finances and the fiscal health of Connecticut?
Gary, thank you very much for asking that question. That is the question that any candidate for governor in either party needs to be able to answer satisfactorily to earn your vote. And that is why it is the first topic that we addressed on our website with a very specific plan. As I was talking with people here before we began, they said, "You're the guy who's going to take away my pensions, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm the guy who's going to save your pensions." In the private sector, if your pensions are funded at below 80%, you are sent to the Pension Fund Guarantee Corporation because there's never enough money ever to refund them. And so what we talk about is not reforming our retirement liabilities, but restructuring them. We need somebody from the business world who understands finance, who understands the numbers, and who has the independence and the willingness to talk about this the same way, whether you're talking to a retiree, whether you're talking to a taxpayer that is paying for benefits, guaranteeing benefits they can't get for themselves, or to our children whose future we are stealing. The specific plan that we've put in place is to create an independent, locked, privately managed trust. What do I mean by that? We're going to take the existing assets in our state employees. We are only funded at 30%, an appalling number. We're going to add to that because that's too little. We're going to make a lump sum payment of additional money. We're going to add state-owned assets like real estate. And if they join us as true partners in this, if they allow us to compensate them as much as they are in the private sector, if they allow us to have the right size workforce, we will make them partners in the future upside of our state. And so what I say to the employee unions is, come join us. Let's have an honest conversation. After the Supreme Court Janus decision, we can talk directly to you, and let's go solve this problem together.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
Gary, when I was elected first selectman of the town of Trumbull in 2009, I inherited a pension fund that was only funded at 27%. There was more money going out to pay pension beneficiaries than coming into the fund. It was one of the main reasons why the year before I took office, the financial rating agencies downgraded our credit rating. So I took the position that we needed to fix this problem and we could no longer kick the can. I led by example. I refused a pension from the town of Trumbull, insisted that all my department heads do the same, and working with our labor leaders, we were able to renegotiate 9 labor agreements that now have defined contribution plans for all new employee hires, so long-term you reduce the unfunded liability. We took it a step further. Somebody came to me and said, well, why don't you just borrow some money to meet your annual required contribution? And I said I wasn't going to do that, because that's what Denise Napier has done, and that hasn't worked out very well. I said we're going to treat this as a fixed cost. We're going to build it into our operating budget. So we invested $48.8 million additional dollars into our pension fund over 8 years. We didn't borrow money. We didn't create a new obligation to fund an existing obligation. And then we said we're never going to let this problem happen again. So I introduced legislation before the town council, approved on a bipartisan basis, that says you must fund the annual required contribution every year, and the only way you cannot is with a 2/3 supermajority to override the legislative provision. Because I vowed that I would never allow somebody to come after me and kick the can like Democrats did the 40 years before me. The next governor is going to have to deal with this problem right out of the gate. When I'm elected governor of the state of Connecticut, I will send a budget repair bill to the legislature in my first 45 days that deals with this problem in a similar way to Rhode Island and Wisconsin. The CBAC agreement is going to have to come back to the table. And that's not going to be easy because it accounts for 40% of the budget. It's going to require every legal and statutory remedy at law to deal with this problem. Because we have to let our retirees know, and our people that are working now, if we do not deal with this problem now, their retirement is at risk.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsidnik.
This is about fiscal stability. This is about talking to a pensioner who is expecting to get a pension and make them understand that this is about their fiscal stability, that they will get a pension. This is about fiscal stability for a worker who's paying into a plan, a state worker, which is going bankrupt. This is about the fiscal stability of the taxpayers of Connecticut that see their taxes going up, but the hole keeps getting bigger. So I believe this is about leadership on a topic where you have to pull together in a short period of time. We'll just talk state employee workers because the teachers are another topic which we can get into. Bring them into the discussion, see if they want to be part of the solution. All the knobs are out there to solve this in terms of annual required contributions, healthcare costs, state assets, bonding schemes, which I've talked to experts in Wall Street on. I've talked to our legislators, senators, and representatives. The answers are out there. What it comes down to is the will to address this problem. And it has to be addressed one way or the other, hopefully in partnership, so we can bring fiscal stability back. But if we can't go through those discussions and reasonable heads do not agree, then we have to look at other remedies, like the sovereign immunity clause in our state constitution, which allows the legislature and the governor, when we are effectively bankrupt, and with $100 billion of liabilities, I would say we've crossed that point, to restructure any agreement to make this state solvent. With me, you get fiscal stability, and some of them will focus on your security. If you're a retiree, I will work to deliver that pension to the best of my ability. If you're a current worker, I want to make sure you have a pension that you can count on, but we have to be able to afford it. And new workers, it's time for a 401k, because that's the way the world works. And taxpayers of Connecticut, my 5-step plan, from targeted tax reduction, taking out costs, will lead to broader-based tax reductions over time and fiscal stability.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
Thank you. So Dan Malloy paints himself as a friend of the unions. And when you're CEO of an organization or the state of Connecticut, or no matter what it is, you have a fiduciary obligation to everybody in your company and everybody in this state. Dan Malloy is not the friend of the unions. You're not the friend of the unions by pretending that a $100 billion underfunded pension plan is going to be solved overnight. Leadership is about being tough. Now, we can exercise the sovereign immunity of the state, and we can bring it to the court, and we'll win, and the Janus case helps. But you have to have had the experience negotiating. And when you're running a 50-person hedge fund, I'm sorry, it's not the same as running a $40 billion organization. What we're going to do is we're going to go in there, and we're going to say we can do it our way, or we can do it the hard way. And we can roll out a series of reforms, everything from lowering the 3% COLA adjustment. We've had that forever in a deflationary environment. People right now, travel time, overtime counts towards your pension. It shouldn't. Who even has a defined benefit pension plan today in these days? So we can restructure it. There's no silver bullet here. But it requires leadership. It requires discipline. It requires experience of having to motivate it, negotiate, and come to the right outcome with people before. That's what we need. I'm the only person in this election that's done anything near on the size of that scale. And it's too important a task for somebody to try to learn that on the job.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. WICC Bridgeport, WEBE HD2 Westport. You're listening to a special broadcast of the WICC 600 GOP gubernatorial primary debate live from the Dogwood Room at Fairfield University. That was just some legal radio stuff that I had to do there for a moment. We're now on to our 1-minute rebuttals. Mr. Stephan.
Gary, coming back to your original question, and I know it can be a bit of a telephone, you asked for the specifics of a detailed plan. Because what we have in the challenge ahead is not one that can be addressed in sound bites. It needs to be addressed with a real plan. And so as you are looking to make a choice among the 5 different options you have for the Republican primary, who is giving you those details? Who is saying to you what could actually be done? I've heard these claims of, oh, we can just put people in a 401k plan. If only it were so easy. Or let's just go negotiate it like I used to do. It's different here. If you're in the private sector, you can use the bankruptcy clause. It applies to you if you're an individual or in a business. We're in a whole new world here. That's why we talk about outside the box thinking. That's why we talk about bringing the best people all over the country together to help us solve this kind of problem. And I believe a finance background here is one that's going to help me do it.
And it's going to require a leader that understands we've got to get the legislature to buy in with any statutory changes. Among that, we have to get out of the retiree healthcare business. We have a $21 billion unfunded healthcare liability on top of pensions. And leaders in the legislature and the executive branch need to lead by example. No more mileage reimbursement padding your pensions. No more pensions for a part-time citizen legislature. No more pensions for politicians.
Thank you, Mr.
Leaders need to lead by example.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Herbst-Sitnick.
I think it's important in here to make a quick distinction between the state workers and the state employee workers. State workers have a contract, which we're talking about opening. The state teachers are a lot like Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo solved it by saying, you know what, you're not going to get your 3% COLA increases until the funds are at 80% funding. And they could do it working with the legislature in Rhode Island. We don't have that luxury here. But what teachers have to understand in Connecticut is they increased the annual contribution on teachers last year. Why? Because the legislature could and will continue until we address the contract. And teachers' annual required contributions, which is greater than the national average, will keep going up, the teacher tax. So I think we have to have an honest conversation with all the stakeholders in here to bring back fiscal stability to our state.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst-Sitnick. Mr. Stefanowski.
This state needs leadership right now. It doesn't need excuses about what can't be done, or it's too hard, or they're hollow promises. This state is dying for leadership. Leadership is not saying how it can't be done. I'm the only one on this stage that has said we're going to eliminate the income tax over 8 years, and trust me, we're going to do it. There's only 2 people on the stage, and Tim, I'm going to agree with you, that actually signed a pledge to not raise taxes in the state of Connecticut. I'm not sure what the others are thinking, whether they're going to raise taxes, but they surely have not signed to say they won't. There's a lot of things we can do structurally. There's a lot of things we can do negotiation-right. But we got to go at it hard. We got to have an aspirational goal. That's what true leaders do, and that's what I'm going to do for this state.
On to our 5th question. This will go back to Tim Herbst, our first candidate. The question will be asked by Dr. Gail Alberta.
The American Society of Civil Engineers issued an infrastructure report card in 2017. According to their report, Connecticut didn't do so hot. 338 bridges are structurally deficient, 273 high hazardous potential dams, 14 hazardous waste sites on the national priority list, 57% of roads are in poor condition, costing motorists an average of $864 per year in car repairs. Wastewater infrastructure needs total approximately 4.6 billion, and drinking water infrastructure needs are around 3.6 billion. Keeping in mind that Connecticut is ranked number 2 in the nation for the most taxed state, how do you, 1, propose your solution to Connecticut's failing infrastructure, and 2, how do you plan on paying for it?
We are in a heap of a mess with our transportation system. And beyond the $86 billion in unfunded liabilities, beyond a $5 billion budget deficit, the next governor is going to have to confront this transportation problem as a top 3 issue that needs to be dealt with right out of the gate. Last year, transportation advocates told the legislature, give us the additional 0.5% on the sales tax. Don't cap us on bonding. And we'll be able to do all that's been approved by the legislature in terms of the capital program. Budget's adopted in October. 4 months later, the governor goes before the Connecticut Press Corps and says $4 billion in approved infrastructure projects will be canceled because the state transportation fund is on the brink of insolvency. His OPM secretary cannot even go to Wall Street and negotiate a successful bond sale. So how are we in this predicament? First, Hartford insiders have time and again raided the Special Transportation Fund to artificially balance the budget. Two, what no one in Hartford seems to be talking about is how this DOT commissioner has increased operational encumbrances in excess of 60% during his tenure. That money comes from somewhere, and it comes from the STF. And the more money that you spend on wasteful operating expenses is less money that you can invest in capital. Third, they have pursued many nice-to-haves and not need-to-haves. We need to be investing in 95, 91, Metro North, Shoreline East. We did not need to spend millions and millions of dollars on a busway to nowhere from Britain to Hartford that nobody uses. So I will use my minute after this to get into how we're going to pay for it. The first thing I'm going to do is authorize my OPM secretary to begin and complete a comprehensive forensic audit of the Special Transportation Fund. Not a politician audit, a forensic audit, so we know where the money's being spent.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsidnik.
Well, I think you start by saving $10 million, not putting it on a toll study, and we put it on fixing a bridge or two, number one. So the answer starts with no new tolls. Because whenever Hartford gets more money, what do they do with it? It goes to some fixed cost. Look, in the Navy we had a saying, it's not what you expect, it's what you inspect. We have a $1.5 trillion special transportation fund, which was rated at $400 million by the governor. And you have to step back and say, where is the discipline? That's not the way I ran my businesses. And when you start looking to inspecting, why does it cost us about $440,000 to build a mile of road and the rest of the nation about $150,000? Why do we pay about $400 to $500 for a gallon of paint, that orange paint that we paint these trucks? I can go to Sherwin-Williams and get it for $50. So I think that's just a few examples. You know, my state road, 136, was repaved last fall. Why? Because it was on the schedule. There was no problem with the road. So I'm not going to take anything more from your pockets until we go through and we audit the projects we have, how we're spending money going forward. And it is right. It's about 91, 95, and the Metro North coming through here and up the shoreline. And I believe it's about selective widening and all the things that we see that can get throughput going faster. And it is around public-private partnerships around our airports and our seaports and our potentially ferry systems, because those can be exploited like other regions of this nation and around the world have done. So it has to be comprehensive, but it has to start with politicians getting their hands out of the cookie jar.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
So Steve stole my thunder on tolls, but it is absolutely not tolls. It's the perfect example of government taking your money in a disguised tax, putting it in a lockbox. Now, why a government even needs a lockbox to assure you that they're going to do what they say they're going to do is one thing. And then they raid the lockbox. I mean, you really can't make it up. The other fact is, with a $100 billion underfunded employee plan and a $10 billion deficit this governor is about to step into, David would say it's 11, but whatever, we're not going to find the money. So it's a combination of two things. It's cost cuts. It's right-sizing government. Government is too big. There's too many layers. There's too much bureaucracy. It's reprioritizing. Not spending money on a bus to Hartford, spending it on education, spending it to repair roads and bridges. It's restructure, getting at the elephant in the room, which is the CVAC agreement. It's reform. Reforming the system, spending more wisely, having people be held accountable. What a novel idea that is. These people in Hartford take our money. How about holding them accountable for it? And it's revitalization, getting our cities going and attracting people back to this state. But you can't ignore the revenue side. One of the first things Dr. Arthur Lafford told me is whether you're a family, whether you're a business, whether you're a country, you cannot cut your way to prosperity, no matter how much you try. What you have to do is build the top line. We're going to build that through my 5-point plan. Eliminate the estate tax. Get rid of the corporate income tax over 2 years. Eliminate the state income tax over 8 years. Rip out cost with zero-based budgeting. And give the power back to the people with a taxpayer bill of rights. There's a novel idea. Term limits, referendum, initiative, recall. That's what we're going to do to turn this state around and fix our infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
So Bob, you talk about accountability, so let's hold accountability to the numbers. The real number is 11 billion. Look it up, we'll send you the link. It's the official government number. It's a number you should know, and we'll send you the link so that you know it. In terms of infrastructure, this is something that we care about deeply in our state. We come back to what's the competitive advantages of our state. Our location is one of those key competitive advantages. But if you can't get here quickly, it's not an advantage anymore. That strip of I-95 out there between Bridgeport and Stamford is the third most congested in the country. Our trains are slower today than they were in 1970. We have bridges built in the Taft administration. They look like they're over 100 years old because they are over 100 years old. The question that you asked, though, is how are we going to pay for them? Dan Malloy says taxes, and not just taxes. He wants to make us the most taxed state in the country. And Themis Claridis, our leader in the House, she said no to tolls. She's been a strong leader, and it's our responsibility to make her the next Speaker of the House so that we can do the right thing by this issue. But the question again is, how are you going to pay for it? So the way we're going to pay for it is we're going to attract billions of dollars of private investment. How do I know that we can do this? Because in my business, we own the shares of companies that did exactly that. They ran the airports, they ran the roads, they ran the trains. These are multi-billion-dollar projects that we want to have the private sector do. The people I've spoken to make this happen include the guy who advised Governor Jeb Bush that put in place the private-public partnerships that make the infrastructure in Florida a terrific experience there. That's what we need to bring here. We're going to get the train from New York City to Stamford in 30 minutes, Bridgeport in 45, New Haven in 60. We're going to add lanes to 95, and we're going to turn Sikorsky into a major regional airport. That's what we're going to do.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Time for our 1-minute rebuttals. First, Mr. Herbst.
Every year I was the first selectman of the town of Trumbull. I was required to bring before the town council for their approval a capital program that identified a 5-year, 10-year, 15, and 20-year forecast of priorities needed to invest in infrastructure. We didn't do that aggressively before I got elected. We modernized 9 schools. We repaved 1/4 of our roads in 8 years. And we did that because I said to my public works director, you are to identify the priorities, the need-to-haves. And we're going to develop a capital budget that is sensible, that's affordable. When we talk about infrastructure, one of the things that I believe the next governor should look at is a complete top-down review of our assets. We need to do an asset inventory. There's a lot of state-owned property that we're not using, that we're not maximizing. I would consider a plan to lease back some of that state property and to use the revenues derived from those leasebacks as dedicated funds that would go into the STF in addition to what's been mentioned. I am not in favor of tolls. I am not in favor of increasing the gas tax. We've got to cut the gas tax, no tolls, and come up with a plan that makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. Mr. Obsidnik.
Well, I think he said the average car gets about $800 worth of maintenance on our roads. I tried driving RV1, which has my RV, which we call RV1 instead of Air Force One. I think we've already put about $4,000 into pothole damage. I think an important part of the conversation has to be the train rail into New York. My wife goes in 3 to 4 days a week. I've lost 30 minutes of her time every day she goes between 2005 and 2018. A big part of the reason is we have 3 structurally unsound bridges where trains have to slow down to 30 miles an hour to cross over. So when are we going to fix those bridges? Are we going to have a catastrophe like Minnesota had before we get our act together? And that will require federal dollars to be part of the solution. And that will require a better relationship that your governor has with Washington than what we have right now. And honestly, our senators and congressmen should be doing a lot more to be getting funding here for those bridges so we can make sure my wife and your family members come home safely.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
Anyone know what May 21st represents? Well, they're not allowed to talk, so I won't ask, but Happens for my birthday, but it's also Tax Independence Day in the state of Connecticut. It is the day between January 1st and May 21st where you've paid off your federal and state tax liability. It's 2 weeks later than any other state in the country. What do we do with that money? We've got the 4th worst roads and bridges in the nation. It gets back to accountability. If we're going to take more money from our people than any other state in the nation, we shouldn't have the worst roads and bridges. That would never happen in the private sector, but somehow in this mass up in Hartford, it all gets lost. And then to Steve's point, what does he do? He wants to come out and spend $10 million on a study to put tolls up 5 years from now. You can't make this stuff up. We need somebody in that governor's mansion who has common sense, who's run a big organization, and is willing to make the tough decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
So in the additional minute, let me give you a little more detail and paint a picture for you. I was told early on in my career that a good question is one for which I have an answer, a great question is one for which I have a slide. And in this case, this is one for which I have a presentation on my website. So I'd say go to my website. We have a 16-page presentation specifically on this topic because it's a very important one. In outlining this of showing what would it actually mean bringing it to life, we created something called Bridgeport 2028. And I did a Facebook Live tour walking people through what would it mean to the town of Bridgeport if we could the train there in 45 minutes, if we could add lanes to 95, if we could create Sikorsky Airport as a major regional hub. We walked you through. There's the beginnings of development there, even with the terrible taxes and regulations in Steel Point Harbor. There's an interest in investing $675 million to create an entertainment complex. When we do these things, when we harness private capital, cities like Bridgeport and all over this state are going to take off.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. We have now our final question of the evening. This one will first go to Mr. Obsitnik and will be asked by Dr. Gary Rose.
Okay, thank you. My question pertains to your ability to govern. There is a strong possibility that as a result of the forthcoming state legislative elections, that the Connecticut General Assembly will contain Democratic majorities in both legislative chambers. There is that possibility. If elected governor, and should the legislature remain under the control of the Democratic Party, what skill set will you bring to the governor's office that will help you navigate your policy agenda and will enhance your ability to work across the aisle, particularly in an atmosphere characterized by intense partisan polarization these days?
Well, I'm not giving up on that it will be a Democratic legislature, first of all. I think the biggest thing for me is leadership. And when you find yourself in a nuclear submarine 500 feet under the polarized cap on a Sunday morning, and you got to get the men up to go clean the bilge, you don't sit out there and take the uniform code of military justice and say, I'm a lieutenant and you're enlisted to clean the bilge. What you do is you get in the bilge with them. And you start painting a vision for why are we doing this? What is our goal and our objective? And that's just my mindset. Like, I am a job maker, right? So I think your next governor to solve these problems can't be a taker, because we've had takers in Hartford for far too long. Politicians who take money out of your pocket and put it in their pocket to pay taxes. Your pocket gets smaller, theirs gets bigger. But what job makers do have a founder's mentality, an owner's mentality about scarcity and opportunity costs. And I've made those decisions in my career in the military and in the private sector running businesses. So I work well with people. I'm not the smartest person in the room. I know that, right? But I probably am the best leader. I'm the best person that brings people together to define a vision that people want to aspire to. The income tax is a good example. I love how it sounds. You just never get a second sentence about how you're going to get there. And there are people in the state I've met who actually want the state income tax, right? So how is that vision going to work? But who does not want to build 300,000 jobs? Raise your hand, right? That is a unifying vision that a leader will get us around. And that will be the lens by which we evaluate projects that we take forward. So leadership, without a doubt, is the greatest skill that I've been trained in. And I thank the United States Navy for that.
Thank you, Mr. Obsitnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
So we get that question a lot as a group, and the common refrain from some is, well, government's different than business, you can't just fire people. It's nonsense. I started at GE after graduating from Fairfield. I started at GE. It's a company with 300,000 employees. I worked my way up from an entry-level person to be one of the top 50 officers in the company. I didn't always have people reporting to me. You know how you get that done? You know how to build consensus. You know how to negotiate. You know how to build alliances. Look at our governor from the public sector. He got thrown out of the budget discussions by his own party. Where else do you ever see that happen? At UBS Investment Bank, I had a $500 billion business over 35 countries. You think when I sat those people down and said, hey, here's a great day, we're going to introduce zero-based budgeting, we're going to cut everybody's budget by 25%, you think we were all holding arms around the table? I didn't have the ability to fire those people. They were my peers. So it's about having done it before, knowing how to deal with people, knowing how to build alliances before you need it. Government experience has proven time and time again that they don't know how to do it. If it did, these cities, these towns in our state would not be in the shape that it's in right now. We need somebody from the outside sector who's run an organization. State of Connecticut, $40 billion annual budget. Do you know how hard that is? We can't afford to put somebody in there who's never done it before. I've got the skill set, I've got a track record, I've got the integrity, I've got the diligence, I've got the budgeting skills. I will get it done for the state of Connecticut. I hope we have a majority in the House and the Senate. I trust that we will, but if we don't, I'll still get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
Gary, thanks again. Another phenomenal question for us. So this is another one of these big enchiladas here. And so if I look at the experience that we had in Illinois and in Michigan, they both hired somebody as their governor that looked a lot like me. It was a business person who was an outsider that came in looking to bring about change in very troubled states, in Illinois and in Michigan. And in Illinois, they hired, along with him, a Democratic legislature. And that state is going to be next after Puerto Rico, going down, testing what happens when you can't pay your bills. In Michigan, Rick Snyder, who was introduced to the people as one tough nerd, who said, I'm going to tell it like it is. He also had what he called RPA, relentless positive attitude. And he painted a picture of what it was to be proud to be a Michigander. And he created a positive image. And as a result, he brought a majority in both houses of the legislature. That would be a huge change. We have Themis Claridis as our next speaker. But we have Len Fasano as our next majority leader. We will be able to make the extraordinary changes that are required here. If that does not happen, we then need to have somebody who will bring us together by not having a series of zero-sum game solutions. This is what we talk about outside-the-box thinking. We need somebody who can propose solutions that are not about this side or that side. It's about being an entrepreneur. My background was not managing hundreds of thousands of people. It was about building a business. It was about seeing opportunities that other people could not in global financial markets. We need somebody who is a builder, who can inspire. That's how we will bring people together.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
Whenever I hear somebody talk about leadership and leading an organization, when I hear the word I used repeatedly, it gives me pause for concern. Because I learned at a very young age, being the son of a football coach, if you're going to move the chains down the field, it requires the whole team. The line, the backfield, the defense, the whole team. And a governor needs to have the humility to recognize that they are not the smartest person in the room, depending upon whatever the situation they're in. A governor needs to have the humility to recognize, especially under these scenarios and these unprecedented times that we live in, governor needs to recognize that they need to hire people to serve in their administration, to lead departments, commissions. Those people need to be smarter at what they do. And they can't be yes people. One thing I hated when I was first selected in the town of Trumbull was when people would always agree with me. I don't like bobbleheads working for me. I want people that are going to push back, that are going to disagree, and that are going to give me an alternate point of view. Very often, I love when I would have a cabinet meeting with my senior staff and department heads would disagree with one another. And that would allow me to formulate a plan that was sometimes somewhere in the middle. That's what the next governor of the state of Connecticut must do. And that is what the next governor of the state of Connecticut must recognize. The office of governor is bigger than any one man or woman in the state of Connecticut. And it is going to take a governor that understands the meaning of team, that understands the meaning of leadership, is that leaders are as effective as the people they surround themselves with, hiring people that are going to give you honest, straightforward advice, and also having a set of principles that will help you deal perhaps with the legislature or the other party. Because when you have core convictions, when you don't find your value system in a poll or a focus group, you can compromise on issues without compromising on your principles.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. For our 1-minute rebuttals, Mr. Obsidnik.
You know, look, as a business outsider, I think we see that's the trend here in America. Charlie Baker's running circles around us in Massachusetts, Rick Scott in Florida. What's different about me is I've been in and around government my entire life, effectively. You know, 9 years in the U.S. military. I served, while I was there, worked with the U.S. Navy Senate Liaison Office. I know and understand the legislative process. I was on the U.S. Small Business National Advisory Board, and government has been my customer, redoing DMVs around the country and Department of Taxation and Revenues. So back to the point that this is about team and mobilizing people about a big vision. But I don't have to have all the right answers. We have Senator Wong and Representative Kupchak. They put forward 16 balanced budgets over the last 8 years. We have a lot of great answers in here. You just have to have someone who can win an election in Connecticut and someone who can work with people and take ideas that are there, not flying experts from around the world. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But this is about team. And a veteran just explained to me the other day what team stands for. Together, everyone achieves mission. That's what you get with me.
Thank you, Mr. Obsidnik. Mr. Stefanowski.
I'll tell you a quick story to indicate the difference between public sector and private sector management. It was the last meeting between Dan Malloy and, at the time, Jeff Emmett was running GE. This was the last meeting to keep GE in the state. And Malloy and his crowd showed up at GE with a presentation. And they're going to go through all the benefits of staying in Connecticut. And on the front page of that presentation was a picture of a jet engine. Unfortunately, it was a Pratt & Whitney jet engine, not a GE jet engine. Was anybody fired? No. Who's blamed? GE. You know, the problem is not that these government officials don't know what to do. The problem is there's no accountability. If that had happened in the private sector, I would have been fired within 30 seconds. A CEO of an organization the size of Connecticut would never be kicked out of the budget discussions. We got to get real here, ladies and gentlemen. We have to get somebody in the state who knows how to lead, who's done it on that scale, and is going to have the guts and the integrity to think boldly about things like getting rid of the state income tax.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
So let me tell you a little bit more about my business experience and about bringing people together. So when I went out on my own, I found myself at a single desk, and I said, I am going to need to figure out how to build the right team to invest in businesses all over the world. I need to find people who will join me. I need to set a vision of what it is we're going to achieve. I need to set the values. I need to find people and develop relationships with them to compete in some of the toughest markets on earth. Our first year was 2008, the worst financial crisis in 70 years. We had 100 stocks in our portfolio. If it were just me, we would have gone out of business very quickly. We need to build an IT infrastructure, a compliance network. It isn't required that somebody has the direct experience themselves to do anything and everything. It's the person who sets that vision, who creates those values, and brings people together. That's what we need to do here in Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
The candid conversations and the straight talk is what's sorely lacking in our state government, where people don't talk at each other through tweets and Facebook updates, but instead have face-to-face conversations. I look back at my 8 years and I look at things like senior tax relief and charter revision and pension reform and our budgets and full-day kindergarten and comprehensive early childhood programs and our infrastructure. And despite the political disagreements that we had, and they were and sometimes big political disagreements. Each and every one of those initiatives passed on a bipartisan basis, because I took the time as a leader to have those conversations one at a time with every member of our legislative body, our Board of Finance. The next governor has to be willing to put that time in to have those one-on-one, face-to-face conversations with people in both parties. It goes back to what I said. I didn't find my value system in a poll or a focus group. I am a Republican, and I've been a Republican my whole life. But I believe when you have principles, you can compromise on issues without compromising on your core.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. That concludes our questions for this evening. We now prepare for 2-minute closing statements by our candidates, and we will continue with how we've been going, which means it will be Mr. Stefanowski who will be leading with our closing statements.
So I gotta tell you, this politics is a crazy business. You know, I got a guy chopping at me all night tonight for being a Democrat for 9 months. The guy was a Democrat for 7 years. The guy gave thousands of dollars to Barack Obama. The guy runs a 50-person hedge fund. Okay, so I think it's time, ladies and gentlemen, to not get distracted by details and mudslinging and attack TV ads. It's time to focus on who's the best person to turn this state around. I am first and foremost an outsider. I know how to negotiate. I know how to cut costs. I know how to build consensus, and I know how to execute a plan. I'm a conservative, and I'm committed to governing like one. My 5-point plan is endorsed by the same economists who wrote up Donald Trump's tax plan and Ronald Reagan's tax plan. We need bold thinking in this state. We're going to eliminate the death tax. We're going to eliminate the corporate tax over 2 years. We're going to phase out, yes, we're going to phase out the state income tax over 8 years, nothing less. We're going to use zero-based budgeting to rip costs out of this state like you've never seen. And we're going to institute a taxpayer bill of rights to give the power back to the people. We need to have somebody in that governor office that people are going to be proud of. Not somebody slinging mud, not somebody putting TV attack ads out, not somebody telling you it can't be done. This state is in a crisis. Let's not waste this opportunity by a bunch of distractions. Let's focus on who the true leader is here, standing up here today, who has a real plan to do it, who has the experience to do it, the proven track record, and is going to deliver for the state of Connecticut. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanowski. Mr. Stemmerman.
So let me tell you a little bit about why I'm doing this and how we're going to make the lives of the people better in this state. My grandfather, who I was very close to, grew up in Newark, New Jersey. He was the son of a wallpaper hanger who came to this country in search of a better life. And he was the first one in his family to go to college. He was raised by his siblings because his mother died when he was 2 years old. And every year he had us read the words from the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free, and said, never forget you live in the greatest country on earth where we are safe and where we have tremendous opportunity. The other image I have growing up is a contrast in leadership. I remember Jimmy Carter addressing the nation from the Oval Office in a beige cardigan. And he did it right after a spike in oil prices. And he went over to the thermostat and he turned the knob down. And he said, it's time to learn to live with less. That's what Dan Malloy has been saying to us here. Ronald Reagan had a very different vision. He wore a great suit. He wore a nice tie. I taught my 4th child, Charlie, how to tie a tie, and we saw a picture of a Windsor knot. And Ronald Reagan, he tied one great Windsor knot. He said, it can be morning in America. I won't accept containing communism. We're going to win the Cold War. My youngest son, William, is 9 years old, and he asked me just a few days ago, if he could live anywhere in the world, where would you live? And he likes video games, so he said, would you live in Japan? I said, William, I would live right here, in this country, in this state, in this house. I chose Connecticut. I chose to come here for a job, I chose to raise my family here, and I chose to start a business here because it was the best place in the country to live, work, and raise a family. With the right leadership and with all of your support, it can and it will be again.
Thank you, Mr. Stemmerman. Mr. Herbst.
Without question, this is the most consequential and important state election of our lifetime. And over the course of the last year and a half, as I have participated in every single debate and met with voters all across our state, this primary election on August 14th comes down to one word, and that word is trust. Who can Republican primary voters trust? Trust to not only prosecute the campaign that will lead us to victory in November, but more importantly, who can Republican primary voters trust to govern like a Republican come January of 2019? I never thought that I would run for governor of the state of Connecticut and be participating in a Republican primary debate where there was a debate over who in this primary is a bigger Democrat who's giving more money to Democrats. That's just nuts. Folks, I've been a Republican my entire life. I have voted in every single election. I served my community because I wanted to make it better. I saw a problem, I wanted to try and fix it. And one thing I know is that we lost two very close elections for governor that should not be lost. And we have seen that elections have consequences. And we have seen what has happened to the state of Connecticut over the last 8 years. Republicans want to win. We can't afford to lose to retread Ned. We have to win. Because if we can't win an election, we can't fix the state. And you know what? In the land of steady habits, we have seen here in Connecticut what has happened when we nominate candidates who haven't won tough elections, who are unvetted, untested, and unproven. That's when we lose elections. The time has come to nominate proven reformers and Hartford outsiders that have been through tough elections, that have won tough elections, and that are prepared to take the fight to Ned Lamont and the Democrats to lead us to victory in November so that the reality of Connecticut can live up to the promise of Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herbst. And Mr. Obsidian.
Yeah, the first night I went to the North Pole, my submarine, my captain took me back to engineering space, and he said, Steve, I'll give you the one leadership lesson you need to know the rest of your life. Leaders set tone, tone creates culture, and culture is your destiny. Leaders set tone, tone creates culture, culture is your destiny. At the time, I had no idea what he was talking about. But after watching many people in leadership positions, and this governor, Dan Malloy, I'll tell you, his tone of the chief apologizer, the chief tax collector, has driven people and opportunity out of this state. I will be the chief economic development officer of this state. I will be the chief tax reformer of this state. I will be the chief spending reduction officer of this state. So this comes down to tone. It comes down to tone you want to have in a leader, someone who has the experience, plan, and character. So yes, it comes down to what I said at the outset. The mindset of your leader. Do you want a maker or do you want a taker? I'm a job maker. For far too long, we've been led by takers. And what politicians do, if you trust a politician, hire another one. They take money from your pocket, put it in their pocket gets smaller, theirs gets bigger. But when I get involved as a job maker building products, everyone's pocket gets more full. That's the mindset we need to have in a leader in Connecticut. And look, on a submarine, we're all trained firefighters. We're trained to run to the fire. And that's what you get with me, someone who is focused in experience and character and has a plan, a 5-step plan to build 300,000 jobs to turn the moving vans around. August 14th is coming fast. I've been a Republican all my life. I support Republicans. I have the values that this party needs, I believe, and this state, in order so we can bring prosperity back to Connecticut. My name is Steve Obsidian, and I'm working hard with my RV to win your vote on August 14th. Thank you.
This is now your opportunity to cheer for your candidates.